we just got the announcement of Historic Anthology 7 and 3 new cards coming directly into the Historic and Historic Brawl format on Arena. But I feel like there's a lot of awesome cards that should also be included in Historic Anthology 7, so here's my pick for the top 10 cards that should be included in Historic Anthology 7 or Historic Anthologies beyond that. Starting off, it's actually 10 cards. It is the Ravnican Signets that all cost 2 mana. These Signets are staples in Commander, letting you ramp out on turn 2, and we don't have any of them on Arena currently, and this would be a great place to add them, especially since Anthologies typically add 1 or 2 cycles of cards to the game. Like last Anthology, we got the 10 Indestructible Artifact Dual Lands from Modern Horizons. This just seems like a no-brainer that makes Historic Brawl one step closer to Commander by letting non-green decks still ramp decently well. On top of that, the 3 cards revealed for the Anthology already seem to try and focus on Historic Brawl, and I think this is just going to add to that, and Wizards is going to focus more on Historic Brawl as they see there is a lot of love for the format. Next up is one targeted more at traditional Historic. I would love to see Wrenn and 6 get added to the Historic format. As Historic becomes more and more powerful, it gets closer and closer to Modern in terms of power level, and in some ways it's actually surpassed it. Now, it's powerful in Modern for a couple key reasons. The biggest one being that it can recur fetch lands from the graveyard back to your hand, and allows you to get a lot of repeatable value for just 2 mana, allowing you to recur your lands and deal with your opponent's small creatures with its ability to deal damage. Plus, it leaves some pressure that if you do ult, you can keep recasting your spells. In Historic, I don't think this would be nearly as much of a problem, as fetch lands aren't a thing in the format yet, although when they do, Wrenn and 6 will be a nice addition to decks that are running it, but I think it is still a lot of value that some decks would still want to have. You know, if a deck cares about putting cards in its graveyard or discarding or doing any of those things for 2 mana, they can get an efficient value piece without having the overwhelming power of Wrenn and 6 in a format with fetch lands. I think it's like the perfect card for Historic, where it's going to be powerful, but it's not super broken because some of the cards that it's super broken with aren't in the format. Overall, I think it'd be a really cool addition to see. Third, Lightning Greaves would be an awesome addition to Historic, and more specifically Historic Brawl, allowing for commanders that need to be removed on site to have a little more resilience in such a high single target removal format. Again, similar to the Signet, this is just another commander staple that I don't believe would negatively impact normal Historic while bringing Historic Brawl a little closer to Commander. Remember, you can have extra powerful cards in Historic Brawl because it's singleton with 100 cards, and I'm really excited to see where the format goes as new cards are introduced for the format. I think it's really one of the most fun ways to play Arena, and I really hope they keep adding cards for it. Next up, number 4, I would love to see Murktide Regent get added to Historic. And this is the one I was the least sure about on the entire list because I do worry that it's a little bit too powerful for the format. This would obviously be going in the shell of Izzet Phoenix, a deck that was super popular in Arena but then got slightly nerfed and really has fallen out of favor. But ever since then, we've kind of had this sludge of Grixis and Rakdos good stuff, and I really think having other strategies go up to the top would be really great. I think Murktide Regent would be a really great way to do that. I think there's a lot of reasons to add it. You know, it allows for a new type of deck to be reintroduced into the format, and that was one of the stated goals of Historic Anthologies, is to both introduce new archetypes and reinvigorate old archetypes that aren't necessarily as powerful as they were before. Either way, while I think it would be really powerful, I think it would be really good for the format to allow another deck to compete with Rakdos midrange, and I think it would just reinvigorate an archetype that's a little underplayed, that has seen some play before in a really interesting way. Next up, number 5 is Phantasmal Image. It's a 2-cost blue creature that can come into the battlefield as a copy of anything, but whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability, you have to sacrifice it. It's a really cheap clone, and it's really good in formats like Commander, where you can take the biggest, splashiest thing on the board and get your own copy of it for just 2 mana. And I think that kind of gameplay is really fun, and is something I would really want to encourage in a format like Historic Brawl. It is a little different being a 1v1 format, but I think clones are some of the most fun cards, and being able to clone your opponent's stuff is really, really awesome as well. So I'd love to see it introduced as another awesome card that sees a lot of play in Commander that could also see play in Historic Brawl, bringing the two formats closer together. Next up, number 6 is Prismatic Ending. This is a card from Modern Horizons 2 that's X and a white for a sorcery, and it lets you exile a non-land permanent if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. It's one of the best removal spells in Modern, and I think it could do some really good work in Historic as well. The format has become dominated by low-cost threats, and so I think having more options to respond to them, especially in colors other than black and red, would be really good for the format, allowing more decks to shine. For example, allowing you to run more white decks because you can deal with some of the more annoying threats given off by your opponents at those lower mana value. Overall, it's just a really efficient spell that would allow other colors to shine in Historic that aren't necessarily seeing a lot of play right now. Next up, number 7, we have Damnation. And I think this is a really interesting pick, but it's one I kind of went back and forth on. Currently in Historic, we have Wrath of God, which is essentially a white color shifted Damnation. It says destroy all creatures that can't be regenerated, and I see this really as a pick for black decks in Historic Brawl. The format has become kind of dominated by single target removal, and I don't necessarily love the idea of it getting more control-y, but I do think just a classic good old board wipe in every color would be kind of nice to have, as something that could be pretty consistently played across all decks, which would help players reduce the amount of wild cards they're spending, which I know isn't in Wizards of the Coast's best interest, but if we could have, Blasphemous Act in red, Wrath of God in white, Damnation in black, and at least, all you have to do is craft one in each of the colors, and you are able to at least put one in every Historic Brawl deck. We already know Cyclonic Rift is coming with Explorer Anthology, and so I think having the black version of the just generically good in every deck board wipe, that would be really awesome to have to make deck building a little more consistent. Number 8 is one that I know a lot of people are going to disagree with, but in my opinion, Historic is its most fun when it's its most powerful. It allows it to be different than something like Standard or Alchemy, and so I think introducing a card like Stoneforge Mystic would be a really interesting way to shake up the format and instantly introduce a new deck archetype. Stoneforge Mystic is very powerful. It sees a lot of play in Modern and was banned at one point in the format as well, but I think it's a really interesting concept to throw it into Historic, because I think Historic is its most fun when it's its most powerful. Arena only has a couple formats on it compared to the vast number that exist, and so I think having the formats be different enough where each one is a different experience and I have a reason to play each one is really good. I think Standard and Alchemy are great as a good entry level. Explorer allows you to add a little bit more power but still be balanced, and I think Historic should be the place for fun combos and really powerful stuff to allow it to be kind of MTG Arena's legacy or vintage. Now obviously that can't happen right away, otherwise we'd be just looking at adding a ton of powerful cards way too quickly and just invalidating everyone's decks. But I think a good way to get us to a more powerful Historic is to add cards like Stoneforge Mystic. I know that might not be the popular opinion, but I do think it's a good way to differentiate things like Explorer and Historic. Alright, next up, number 9 is Mulldrifter. A really simple card, but one that's also really good in Commander. When it ETBs, you draw 2 cards, but you can evoke it for 2 and a blue. Overall, I think it's a very fun card that allows you to play it in all sorts of strategies. Do you want cards in your graveyard? Mulldrifter is a great card. Do you want cards to die? Mulldrifter is a great card. Do you want creatures to enter the battlefield? Mulldrifter is a great card. And it's kind of this way in Commander as well. It has fallen a little bit out, but it's another one of those cards that sees a lot of play in Commander that really wouldn't have that big of an impact on Historic, and I did look for those types of cards to add to this list so that we could have Historic Brawl, feel a lot more like Commander. Again, pushing that power level towards Commander, which technically has a very high power level. I think the 3 cards we've seen are very obviously targeted at Historic Brawl, and I really hope this anthology really targets the average Historic Brawl player, so that's why a lot of the picks on this list are really just, hey, add these Commander staples, it'd be fun. Alright, and finally, number 10 is another pick that's aimed more at Historic. It is Archon of Cruelty. This is just a very powerful black creature, and it gives Reanimator decks a brand new target to hit in the graveyard. Yes, we have some big beaters in Historic, but I think that Reanimator decks are another one of those decks that don't see enough play in the format, and a good way to add more ability for them to see play is to add more awesome targets for them to reanimate. Archon of Cruelty is really good in the fact that if it sticks around, it's going to generate you a lot of value, but even if your opponent immediately gets rid of it, you're still getting some amount of value, and it ends up being pretty devastating. It's just one of the best Reanimator targets in Modern, and I think it's really awesome and would be really cool to introduce that into Historic to allow Reanimator decks to be a little bit more competitive. Alright, those are my picks for the top 10 cards I want to see in Historic Anthology 7 and beyond. Let me know what cards you want to see coming to Historic in the future in the comments down below. And if you want to see more content right now, check out these 2 videos. One of them where I talk about a turn 3 infinite combo that uses absolutely no rares in Historic, and this one where I talk about my top 5 favorite commanders from Lord of the Rings and how I'm personally planning on building them. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.